So before we can adjust to what's different, we've got to grieve for what we've lost. And sometimes, people will be surprised at that, surprised at the feelings they're experiencing, but actually it's an important process that we all go through. Sometimes they'll say to me, I wish people would just do things for me because I don't sometimes feel I can ask, or I don't really know what I'm asking, but I just wish somebody would just do it.
Is there anything that person can do for themselves to help them cope? Hello, I'm Hannah and welcome to the Life and Loss podcast, where we discuss difficult topics including living with a life-limiting illness, dying, death and bereavement. Today I'm joined by Kathy, a counsellor from Forest Holme Hospice. Welcome, Kathy.
Hello, Hannah. Really nice to be here.
And in this episode we will be discussing the emotional impact of receiving a terminal diagnosis, and we'll also share some coping strategies. So Kathy, to begin with, receiving a terminal diagnosis would be extremely distressing and upsetting for that individual and also for their family as well. But what exactly does it mean to receive a terminal diagnosis?
Well, sadly, when someone receives a terminal diagnosis, that will mean that their illness is no longer curable. And then at some point they may well be offered palliative care. And palliative care is more of a holistic approach. So it will be care, the physical aspects of the care, psychological aspects, and also practical. And that's all for hoping to help that patient with quality of life and also help the families. Forest Holme provides palliative care for the patients and families in our community. And I guess as a counsellor, I work within a team, a counselling and psychology team at Forest Holme, and we provide the psychological care.
Okay, and I imagine once that person's received the diagnosis, there's all sorts of emotions that they would feel initially. What sort of emotions have you seen in your counselling room from different patients after they've received a terminal diagnosis?
All sorts of different feelings, an array of different feelings. One of the things that I think I do sometimes see, especially if it's not long after they've been diagnosed, is shock. I mean, it's an enormous thing to take on board, to have to look at your own mortality, I guess. So shock, and that can come in all sorts of different ways. It may be that someone may appear unaffected for a while, numb, in a bubble. And so sometimes when someone sits in front of me, initially they may seem a little bit detached from everything. And I heard another way of describing shock the other day, which I really liked, and that's nature's anaesthetic. And I really could identify with that. It's a way that our mind protects us. It's a defence. And so it can keep us away from feelings that are just too intolerable to go to initially. Yeah.
And do you ever see people who are in complete denial about their diagnosis and don't want to accept that they may be dying?
Well, to be quite honest, I would think most of those wouldn't probably come into the counselling room because they wouldn't acknowledge it. But I think, again, denial is a defence. And sometimes, initially perhaps, sometimes patients will come in for counselling and then they tend to step back a little bit from everything that they were talking about. And sometimes I think denial isn't an all or nothing thing. People can step into denial in a way to cope. So denial sometimes also can just be a temporary thing. Sometimes as a patient becomes more unwell and feels more unwell, that defence is no longer really as easy to be in place. So yeah.
I remember several years ago we met two young girls whose dad was in Forest Holme after dying of cancer, and what they struggled to deal with was the fact that the dad didn't tell them that he was dying, so until it was very late on in the sort of stages of his cancer. And I imagine he was probably trying to protect them from upset, but for them it then became a huge shock towards the end of life that he hadn't told them. Is that quite common?
Every family is different, and the thing is, we all come from somewhere, don't we? We all come, where we're born is a complete accident. And so some people will talk and communicate. Some families do that without having to try. But for somebody else, that's much more uncomfortable to do. Lots of things can get in the way of communication. For some families, you know, if you think about it, we all deal with feelings differently. For one family, talking about emotions and vulnerability might not be something that they do. That might be a no-go area.
Yeah. And imagine quite common in a certain generation as well, where it was sort of stiff upper lip.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, feelings such as anger even, you know, if you had two families together and, you know, two families sat at dinner, you know, two separate families, one family, and they might fall out with each other. One family would make up by pudding, but the other family may not speak for 20 years.
Yeah.
So we all deal with things differently. So communication, though, is so important near end of life. You know, endings are important for grief afterwards. But sometimes, unfortunately, I guess it's true to say that some people will die as they've lived, and if they are private people, then they will continue to be private, or it will be out of love, that they may well protect their family, and in their mind it will be important not to share that with them.
One of the strange things I think about working at Forest Home is when you go down to the ward and you see a lot of the patients, a lot of them seem in a very calm sort of state, almost like an acceptance. Is there a point in which people do reach a level of acceptance or adjustment?
And yes, you know, I do see that. And one of the things that the families and patients experience is anticipatory grief. So before we can adjust to what's different, we've got to grieve for what we've lost. And sometimes, you know, people will be surprised at that, surprised at the feelings they're experiencing, but actually it's an important process that we all go through. By allowing ourselves to work through or talk about what's happening to us and try to make sense of it, that can allow our feelings to become less overwhelming and raw as time goes on, which then allows us to, if you like, integrate that experience into our very being to move on with it. And so I'd like to call it more of an adjustment when I'm with patients and families, but I do see that, which helps them to then be able to kind of put all that energy back into reframing their hope a bit, however long their life is. You know, even if it's in a ward downstairs, you know, wanting to do it their way, investing back in life with their families.
Yeah. We've now reached the halfway point in this interview. If this episode resonates with you, know that you're not alone. Our hope is that by sharing these stories, we can help just one other person living with a life-limiting illness feel less isolated. If you are able, share your thoughts by commenting below. And do you feel age plays a part? So if someone's been given a diagnosis later on in life, is that different to someone maybe who's been given a terminal diagnosis and they're a late teenager or a young adult, for example?
Again, it depends. I have seen, and I can think of a few people that are really close to my heart when I think back, that were older people that may have had quite a struggle in life, perhaps always had a history of anxiety and depression, but they may well find it very, very hard to cope with the diagnosis and be able to let go of life, and other people. But I think younger people as well, that's a different one, because, you know, their lives, it's the wrong chapter for many people. And yes, I do see sometimes that it's difficult for younger people. Although sometimes when I've been counselling younger people, I'm thinking about somebody now, a young woman who was diagnosed with bowel cancer, busy, getting on with her life, wasn't ill for very long, but was diagnosed with cancer, but at the same time with a palliative prognosis, and a short palliative prognosis. For her, she wanted to come in, she was terrified and high levels of anxiety, awake at night, thinking about death, thinking about all those things. But, you know, I saw her not long ago, and actually now she's come to a place where she's found a way of putting it somewhere to invest back in her life. And I think that's where avoidance, a bit like denial, avoidance plays a part sometimes. And it's really important to go really gently with people because they've put that defence there for a reason.
Yes.
And it's there to help them to cope. And so for somebody like that young woman, you know, we will stay connected, but I will follow what she needs when she needs to come back in, if she needs a one-off session, if she needs to have a group of sessions, then we'll do that. But at the moment, I will reflect where she is, and I just sort of suggested to her that perhaps now's the time that she could really get out there and live with what she's got, and she agreed. And so, yeah.
And so for someone like that lady that you've just spoken about, if she, at the initial point when she was given the diagnosis, and she obviously then has to face that she's got to tell her friends, her family, her loved ones and her colleagues, how should those people, is there a way that they should react to the news, for example? Should they try and be brave for them, or should they show their emotion and cry? Is there a right and wrong way to respond?
I think it's very much about trying to keep in step with that person, to ask them even what they need from them.
Yeah.
You know, but I think it's important for people to try and sort of allow the patients to cope with it in the way they've chosen to cope with it, because everybody deals with things differently. But I think it's really, really comforting for patients to know that they've got friends and family around them. So
Absolutely.
sometimes also, just a small thing, I think sometimes patients don't know what they want. And sometimes they'll say to me, do you know, I wish people would just do things for me, because I don't sometimes feel I can ask, or I don't really know what I'm asking, but I just wish somebody would just do it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's quite nice for if somebody can just take the initiative and make dinner for them if they're going through chemotherapy or radiotherapy, or just feeling really unwell, or for the family. So.
And talking about those sort of like coping mechanisms they've got from support from the family, is there anything that person can do for themselves to help them cope?
I think try to talk, keep the lines open, try not to withdraw. Difficult thing is if that's somebody's nature, if somebody's quite a private person, that might be the tendency for them to do. Somebody else may naturally draw on the people that they care about for support and feel comforted by that. Yeah, and I think doing normal things, allowing themselves to feel the feelings is a bit of a mix. I call it plate spinning. It might sound strange, but when I've got somebody in the room with me, we sit down and sometimes we'll say, let's clear the table. We'll project manage you, you know. We put grief in the middle of the table. That's going to have to be carried around with you. Acknowledge your feelings are going to be there about this.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what small steps can you do to pick up on little things that you like doing that makes you you? So it's about trying to bring a little bit of normality back as well. Because the important thing to remember is that, you know, some of the patients, you know, they will live a quality life. They will go on and live. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that when you've been given a palliative prognosis that you have a very short time left to live. So it's also very much about how does that person find quality in their life again?
And like you mentioned earlier about reframing that hope, I suppose,
Yes.
it's actually, we've got maybe a shorter time than I anticipated I would have of my life, but how can I make that the best it can be, and how can I continue with a new sense of normality?
Yeah. And you know, that's the importance of grief. And sometimes somebody will come sit in the chair opposite me, and I know that they don't really want to be there maybe, or perhaps their wife or their husband have sent them in, and they may say, you know, what's the point of me talking about it or feeling it or having to sit here and cry?
Yeah,
and
because it won't change anything.
It won't change anything.
No.
But do you know what I might say to them is, you know, I wish it could change what's happening to you, but what it can change is how you feel about something.
Yes.
You know, by allowing yourself to talk through things, to feel the feelings that come up if you can, that can change things, that can move us around. There's a grieving process. And what that can do is allow our feelings, if you like, to become less intense, less raw, so that we can then, all that energy that was going into managing those feelings can be put back into reframing our hope, reframing what we wanted, being able to, unbelievably, let go of some of the hopes and dreams that we had before.
That must be incredibly difficult, I think,
Yes.
especially if you feel robbed of your future
Yeah.
that you might have had.
Yes.
A huge adjustment, I imagine, for people.
Yeah. And sometimes that little room is just there for people to share those feelings about that. It's not trying to change it at times, it's about trying to sort of walk one step behind somebody, and when it feels right, to help them to find a way to cope, but to also let them to just try and make sense of the enormity of it all.
And for those that struggle to maybe verbalise how they're feeling, would you recommend writing down how they're feeling? Even art, I've seen people do, they can paint their emotions, because not everyone is comfortable speaking about it. Is it helpful to do that in a different outlet, in a different way?
Yeah, anything. I think journals, people find that really helpful. You know, they might sort of come in and say that they've done that since the beginning of their diagnosis. Yeah. And the other thing is that, you know, anything that can help them to work through their feelings. You know, it doesn't mean they have to come in and sit in front of somebody to do that, but just giving their feelings some space, even if it's when they're in the privacy of their own home, you know, it is important.
And we've had some lovely volunteers at the hospice that one springs to mind that was brilliant at writing and journaling his whole experience of his wife who had cancer. And he would write some lovely poems about the journey and things that have helped him, and they were for his personal use. But actually, they've helped other people because he's been able to share those with others. So yeah, really useful to be able to do that. Yeah.
And I'm thinking of a lady that was part of our service for a very long time. She'd had cancer about 6-7 times since, I think it began the night before her wedding.
Oh wow.
25, 30 years before. And eventually it went on to not be curable anymore. She seemed to manage to go on all that time. And she wrote a book. And it's a really good book, really great book. And her husband finished it for her.
Oh, lovely.
And yeah, so people find all sorts of different outlets. But the important thing is to find the outlet.
Yes.
And exercise, energy, anything, if they feel able to walk, anything, however, you know, anything that will help them to get out and perhaps exercise or to find ways of thinking about it, reflecting on things. But I also encourage them to mix that with the other things, just mixing, you know, seeing their families and trying to engage in life too, if they can.
And if anyone listening today, Kathy, to you speaking as this podcast needs extra help and support, maybe they've recently received a diagnosis, where can they go to initially?
Well, one of the first things I would say is that it would probably be helpful to go and see a GP. The GP can then probably signpost you to all sorts of different places that would be helpful. Also, our service is there if you're struggling with the psychological aspects. The counselling and psychology service are based at Forest Holme, so you can refer yourselves. And if you are somebody that's under 50, Shine Cancer Support is a charity that's supporting young people, and I get a lot of really good feedback from people that have gone to that and joined them. If you've got children, you can come to our service, but you also could actually access Mosaic. And Mosaic is based in Dorset, but it's there for pre-bereavement, I think, as well as bereavement. So.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for listening to the Life and Loss podcast today. If you'd like some further information on our charity, please visit our website, www.foresthomehospice.org.uk, and we hope you tune in to a future episode. If you've been touched by this interview, or if you know someone who could benefit from hearing it, I'd encourage you to like, subscribe and share this podcast. By spreading the word, you help us reach others living with a life-limiting illness, letting them know that they're not alone.